Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.
Good morning to all the participants and colleagues who joined into this broadcast from across the country and more. Our guest this morning is a very special guest, the Deputy CIO of ICICI Prudential Asset Management Equity, Mr. Mrinal, very good morning. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us on this broadcast. It's good to see you, albeit virtually after so long, but always a pleasure nonetheless.
Good morning, Rahul. It's a privilege to be around on this show. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just before we get started, a brief about Mrinal. He's a mechanical engineer from the Bangalore University, then did his MBA from SP Jain in Bombay, and he's had a stint with Bosch briefly and also as a consultant with Wipro before spending a little over the last decade with ICICI Prudential Asset Management. So he's been in various industries before eventually settling down as a fund manager and making it his career. So, Mrinal, I want to start off with the last piece of the employment, which is your current profession as the Deputy CIO of ICICI Prudential. You joined just before the Lehman crisis, if I'm not mistaken. So, let's take you back in time and sort of figure out how that experience was, how you sort of coped with it. Did you ever for once think you had entered the wrong profession because something had hit you so fast, so early in your career at ICICI Prudential?
Well, at least on the professional avatar, that was, baptism by fire in GFC. But then I had personally started investing all the way in mid-90s. So I would say, I had seen two of those, wildfires in the mid-90s, the crisis that the markets had, the Asian crisis as it is called in the history books. And then the dot-com bubble also, 2000, 2001. So in a way, at least what was embedded in my mind, and I used to be studying as well as doing some bit of personal investing those days. It was embedded in my mind that cycles are part of life, boom and bust are part of investing, and that's the interesting part. So to me, the build-up in 2008 was very, very apparent. Actually, the subprime crisis, if I may use the right kind of word for GFC, the subprime crisis, the hints of it were starting to emanate by last quarter of calendar year 2007 already. So it was kind of, known to the experienced hands in the market that it is just a matter of time and something is going to hit. In fact, a lot is woven around October 2008 event. In fact, a sequence of things happened before that, more in New York, because this emanated from there. And then subsequently, things did happen all the way post-October also in the Indian markets, what we typically call the Satyam, crisis. So a lot to learn. Obviously, investing is different when you do at your personal level and when you do it in a professional level. And I was obviously, at professional level, the scales are different. The access to information in terms of data and statistics is very different. So, well, it has been something that I always wanted to do. For me, it worked out in a very good way because I could test a host of things. I was very well prepared for that. And we've had kind of mini crises post that also, the taper tantrum, the Brexit, the Greece issue, and even the commodity dips that we saw in 2016 starting. So, well, reasons could be many, but the fact remains that the markets will go up and down and the boom and bust will be around forever. Yes.
I read somewhere that you consider Naren to be your guru. What were some of the learnings when you joined and, all those, I remember because I had started as the markets editor of what was UTVI then and subsequently became Bloomberg UTV. And we used to come into office at 6 o'clock in the morning, start rolling and, sort of roll all the way. There was virtually no out time. So, I mean, in terms of the work hours, in terms of the systems, processes, obviously the stocks that ICICI Prudential was holding, would have taken a severe beating, as well as pretty much all the funds did at that time. So what were the key learnings that came out of your early days working with Naren, and which has sort of stuck with you through this journey?
So, well, he used to be co-head of equities then, and he was at the front of being the logical voice around in the euphoria of 2007 and 8. And I used to also do, I'm always a fundamental investor, and those days I used to analyze a host of sectors, technology, and a host of other ones, So, but technology was taking the brunt because it was the most US, North America facing sector, and it still is. And because the issues were emanating for there, those kind of stocks were getting battered. And the currency used to be a very different level. It used to be 40s for $1. Now it is almost 70s. So we had, there used to be very few sane and logical voices around. And which is where, not only him, but quite a few others, we used to, converge in terms of thought process. And we used to think about, okay, this is the right thing to do, but the market is going to test us. And when the market does find the new normal, which would be the logical normal as for us, we would have to act in a decisive way and do the right things for the next leg of market movement and do investment. So although I walked into the professional avatar with a lot of theoretical and academic strength, but then there is a large part of practical nuance in terms of skill, because money management has a large portion of what I would call is skill or art, along with science. So the science part is what you can capture in academics or through reading or through literature. The art part is something that you have to own. And it is like, when you look at a money manager, and a host of good exist around, it is, you look at their art. It is the art in which they are trying to manage the monies, they're trying to deal with the markets, they're trying to do or practice their investing. And which is where you appreciate a lot of those finesse that people bring on the table. But then it would be wrong to say that, that finesse is something that you can simply imbibe in yourself. That doesn't happen. It is not like that. In fact, everybody has to find his own stroke of brush, if I may use that analogy, in an artist form. So you might iterate a bit, you might learn from somebody else's mistakes, you might benefit from somebody's strengths, but finally you have to find your own vocation, you have to find your own way of doing things. And having worked in proximity with some of the leading names in the industry, it helped me to, finally get what I would call my own jacket of investing. And obviously colleagues like Naren and others and industry colleagues had a great contribution in that, no doubt about it. Obviously, it doesn't end there. There are a lot of practitioners globally who also decimate and emit a lot of good literature. And you can see a host of them practice through a cycle, and a large amount of academics and statistics is also available around it. So it has helped you form, at least in my case, the foundation of what I would call as I stand today as an investor. So that has been a very enriching experience for me. And I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
That's amazing, Mrinal. And I'll come back to a couple of points that you raised in this answer, but I just want to take you one step back and to the start of your career at Bosch. Was that an offshoot of your engineering days, and how did the shift happen from there to asset management?
So that's something that a lot of people ask me, and let me just take you through the journey. So when I used to be a kid, I always was a free-spirited guy. So I would look at and I come from a background in geography which is humble, and geography which is very unknown kind of thing. So I would look around and see the most free thing I would see is a bird. And I would say, wow, what a life bird has. They can do what they want. They don't have to go to school, maybe. They don't have to give exams. They just live. And if they don't like an environment, they just shift to some other place. And I thought, okay, you can't be bird so bad. You are born like a human, so you don't have wings. Okay, so the next thing I would see is, okay, oh, you see the aeroplanes. They are the next best thing management. And then, those were not the internet days. I would go to the school library and you remember those books, Britannica Encyclopedia, those
Yeah,
large quoted pages and beautiful books. So I would go to the
yeah,
library and flip and say, okay, the Wright brothers made the first flight, and this is the history of aviation. And history was always of interest to me. I till this day I am interested in history, and I consider myself a student of history, and I do read a lot. And then I realized that somehow, the idea of freedom fascinated me, and I always used to think, okay, this is something I want to be associated with. And then when I would ask around, people would say, yeah, you have to do some kind of engineering. And then TV used to be the only entertainment option those days, at least in smaller places. So I would say, okay, in TV, I would see the planes are being made by on the computer. Okay, so there is this thing called computer, and people make planes. So maybe computer engineers make plane, I guess. Then subsequently, when I progressed in my schooling, I realized, no, it's not computer engineers who make planes; it's the mechanical engineers who make planes, and planes get made in India and Bangalore. Okay, so that's the place you got to be if you want to be associated with that. And this is how things progress. And then finally, I realized, okay, although I like this, but this is not my calling. My calling was always the newspaper. When I would flip those days, if you remember, the newspaper used to have the share prices, entire page of data. Share prices and the quotes and the names, and one full page of it, even in the mainstream paper. And the Economic Times and the likes used to have multiple pages of it. And I would always flip and see, what is this? How much data comes every day? Okay, let me track some 10 things. Every day the number changes. Okay, so I would ask some elder around and say, what is a share price? What is share? It's just a part ownership of a business. I said, okay. Beyond that, I would ask, and they would say, I don't know. So maybe you have to pursue education about it. And it was a childlike inquisitiveness which kept on intriguing me. And then I kept on trying to read about it. And during my engineering days also, although I realized that automobile is a more interesting field, it is of interest to me. But finally, I want to step into the arena of the markets. And I simply could not get over it. It was a passion that I could not deny. I knew this is going to suck me in. I knew this is where I want to be, and I wanted to do this forever. And this is all I want to do. But then post engineering from campus, I joined Bosch, a great German company, and it helped me really, really well to practice my engineering education. And I was very delighted about it. I was doing well over there too. And then couple of years, and I thought that now I think I've done justice to my engineering. I need to move on and do an MBA. And when I pursued my MBA, I was very clear that the stepping stone is the final destination for me, and that's the markets. But then, being a small town guy, for me, it was always, big cities are kind of, intimidating to me. I find the pace of life and the inertness of relationships a bit too much for a mid-sized town guy. But then you obviously get used to it. But then at least I wanted best of both worlds, at least to begin with. I did my internship with ICICI, and the CIO those days, Nilesh, told me, yeah, I can see it in you. You have got the spark. Maybe you should join. I said, yeah, I would love to. But then I've lost 2 shirts, 3 belts, and 1 watch while traveling from Andheri to Churchgate. Maybe I'll like to see the world a bit before I step in and think. And then I joined Wipro as a consultant, and I was in United Kingdom also for some time. And I realized, I used to in UK, I used to get up at the NSC opening time and would see, and I would still devote time to investing in research. And then my wife said, if this is what you wanted to do, why are you doing anything else? And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I mean, I just needed that push. And I came back and joined ICICI, which was something of a, back home for me. I was associated with them even during 2003-4. So, and I remember those days, the guys had told me that the spark in you is such that you will come back. You can in the meanwhile go try other factors, but then you're made for this. And they were right. I tried running away. I tried running away from a big city, but I couldn't. And I'm quite happy I came back. And as you mentioned in the first question, baptism by fire, it is delightful. When the going gets tough, that is when the tough get going. And it's very, very interesting in such phases. I always look forward to such times.
as they say, Mrinal, Mullah ki Daud Masjid. So it's probably it was always your calling. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned that you got your boss job and then you moved on here as this was your calling. In fact, even the great Sachin Tendulkar wanted to set out to be a bowler and eventually went on to accomplish some very great things as a batsman. But sort of fast forwarding back to what you were saying in one of your earlier answers in terms of the nuances of investing and the practicality of it. When you joined ICICI Prudential, the assets under management were about 55,000 crores. Today they sit at about 3.5 lakh crores. So that's almost a sevenfold increase, which is no mean feat in about just 12 years. You know, tell us a little bit about how that journey has been. What are the key nuances and practicalities that you've picked up in terms of approaching investing? Either things that you've learned on the job or that you've read and picked up, which you've sort of implemented in your practical life.
So, well, the most important thing, and I'm sure our audience has a lot of individual investors. See, a lot of things at retail level are very much possible. Like, for example, you might have a quantum of trade in terms of value, which could be very easily doable. But when you're in the institutional arena, things are very different. You have market is full of very, very smart people. And it's not only you who knows how to calculate. So this PE EPS business is not going to take you far. This is more or less there. So there is research, and a lot of people are doing very good research. So what kind of approach you need to have to kind of do better than the lot or create an alpha, you might say. And there is an adrenaline in a young blood to create that alpha, to find the new one. So the first thing that an investor, what I seek when I look at potential new guys when we are looking to hire or evaluate, is the spark in them. Is basically I have to find the new stock, the new business. That's very, very important. So that's something that has to be there. So one of the ways to create alpha is to have deeper insights into the business itself. And other way to create alpha would be to bring a lot more patience and temperament on the table. I've seen that the market is actually full. In fact, a large portion of the market is full of very impatient people. People who wouldn't bring a lot of time horizon on the table, wherein the reality is, no matter which way you look at it, if the more time horizon you bring on the table, the compounding effect of equities is phenomenal. In fact, I would go on to say that very often short-term returns are more a function of luck rather than any kind of skill. Skill actually comes across in the longer run through a cycle, through going through phases. Well, as I said, first is deeper insight. So you have to understand the business better, which is where my engineering skills also helped me. Having put a stint in Wipro in IT also helped me. So it brings strengths because your ability to comprehend business, your ability what kind of customers, what kind of demand trends are going to be accepted is something that will, as an investor, do a lot of good to you. So and it's valid to till this day. And any understanding which is superior about the business or the sector or the industry is going to help you as an investor. And also ability to be spot the trends, ability to be spot also the businesses or managements which are going to align to those trends. And change is the only constant phenomena. Having said all that, it's also important that, very often people say that this is going to certainly do well, but it's way too far, which is where the element of valuation comes in. I would say valuation is a most important parameter, no doubt about it, but it's not the only parameter that comes about investing, and which is where actually academics also feature. And you obviously hone a lot of those academic skills when you are a practitioner. We might all think in the academia world that DCF is what works, or PEPS, or things like those is what works. The reality is, there is no black or white, there is gray, and we need to evaluate businesses individually for their own strength. And a host of academia is working around, let's say, the index, the broader market. The reality is, the fund managers don't buy the index; they buy the businesses, and the businesses within the same sectors can have very diverse set of returns. So, what is it that it takes? What is it that in terms of balance sheet that matters? Is the management important? How important? I mean, I very often quote examples to new people in the team, that making a soap is far easier compared to making a, let's say, a car. Car is far more complex to make, but the market rewards FMCG companies far better. It's not because it's easier. It is because the management and the way those businesses are run in terms of return ratios, the capital employed, that is what makes a difference. So it is far more important to get the management assessment right. And failures are the most important things. So in mid 90s, when I was personally investing, I lost quite a bit of money. It might look small these days, but then at that point it mattered to a young student. But then what failures teach you, success doesn't teach you. Success makes you drunk. Failures teach you a lot more. So the earlier you fail, the better it is. And so when you analyze your failures, which is what we did in 2008, 2009, 2010, and it makes you far better investors. Liquidity, the macro impacts on stocks in the markets, the asset allocation between asset classes, how relevant is risk-free rate, how important is competitive dynamics, what is that it takes in financials, what it does it takes in auto, what is that it works in pharma, what is that it works in chemicals, fertilizer, how does government play its part, how do taxation and policy making make an impact. So all these things, every investor goes through it and then he puts into practice. The good part for me was, a lot of things got accelerated because of the crisis, at least in my professional avatar. And I did walk in with anyway a lot of having burned my hands and monies anyway personally. So it benefited, and by 2009, a large part of my I would say investing bracket was already there, and we kept on what I would typically call investing language. We kept on increasing the circle of competency. How to use team? It's also very important. What kind of a person individually cannot do everything, but then how do we use a team to bring on complementary strengths? How do we use access? And just because you have access, you might not get any information. We're not seeking privileged information at all. That's not the idea. But then you're trying to verify what you think could be a potential. You can never meet a CEO, and no offense, you can never meet a CEO which is not going to be bullish about its own business. So that's the nature. That's the game that CEOs are in. CEOs have to be bullish about their own business. Otherwise, how will they drive the energy of the entire organization? But does that mean that everything that they envisage will work out the way they think? What kind of ethics, what kind of morals, what is the contribution to society that the business brings? What is the relevance of goods and services? Is the business built out of, or the product line built out of small short-term benefits? Is it going to be cyclical? And things like those. I can go on and on. That could become a lecture. But then as we progress in the talk, maybe I'll take some examples.
Yeah, no, I'll get to some of the aspects you raised, Mrinal, but I take your point about wanting to sort of the benefits of failing early, the lessons that stick with you for the rest of your life is quite something. You spoke about the perils of short-term investing. I read somewhere that you do not yourself directly invest in stocks anymore, and most of your investments are in your own funds. Is that something that you advise people as well, as opposed to investing directly in stocks, to actually go through the mutual fund route? Not just because you're a mutual fund manager, but because the process has worked for you.
So, well, what I must say is it is very important to be first very clear about financial goals, and not be too short-sighted about it. Like a good financial goal, I would say, if somebody is in ending 30s or starting 30s, is to plan for retirement, to plan for, let's say, a house, maybe 10 years down the lane, to plan for maybe some kind of education kitty for children, maybe some kind of contingency fund. But contingency fund, I wouldn't say is a long-term goal. So that has to be serviced through some other method. But then, if that is the kind of thing that people are clear about, then you have to go about seeking financial planner advice, or you could do it yourself. It's not very difficult. Most educated people can actually read a bit and at least get a sense about broadly where they think they will be allocating their monies in asset classes. It could be a combination of physical, fixed income, or equities based on what kind of risk profile, financial goals, and age and income set they are. And then the important point post that is where you actually need advice on what kind of styles will suit you best. because equities is a volatile asset class and there is a lot of glamour associated, and there are phases where some bit of style and markets could do well, but that might not continue through a cycle. So if you've got a 10-year plus horizon, then you should actually evaluate, okay, what is 10, 15-year old style which has done well through even a crisis, through those things. And these are the kind of advice where, you know, a financial planner could actually benefit. So I would strongly recommend that people do seek professional advice or do some analysis. Very often people are educated enough and wise enough. They might seek advice and focus on allocating monies to good strategies, good fund managers, or good mutual funds, and stick with it. And the ideal way would be a staggered approach, the SIP approach. The important aspect, the point you mentioned, you know, doing it yourself. You know, if you are not in the profession of equity investing, let's say if you run a small business, if you are employed in an IT company or an auto company, well, how will you devote time? It's not that you can't do it, but first of all, you need to have a dedicated in terms of time, in terms of having insight, access, and all those things. Wherein, you know, there is a set of people sitting in our office or any other mutual fund office or professional advisor office who are actually doing it for a living. So, well, it would not be it would not be a fair comparison. You might actually have, let's say, an individual might actually have a better insight, let's say, or superior insight in a stock or two. So, well, you might just actually decide to take that. If you think that you would want to try your chances over there, it's perfectly okay, and you might actually do well. So there's no harm in doing that. But then don't make it a 25 stock thing for you. You know, you might as well, if you want to have a portfolio, choose the right mutual fund portfolio, and, you know, do the right thing over there. And if you still want to dabble with some kind of stocks, do it. If you really think you have an edge over there, maybe because you're associated with that kind of business, maybe you should, you know, put some monies over there. That's perfectly fine. But you should also have a sense about, you know, that what is that it takes to deploy monies. What is the parameter that you need to see? You know, few of them you could be cash flows, maybe some kind of dividend yield. And don't fall prey for stories. The investing is not about IQ. It is about temperament. It is. It is. I would say, you know, investing. I'm just quoting some legends. You know, investing is quite simple, but it is not easy. Why? What is the great thing about investing? And it applies to any asset class, be it gold, equities, fixed income, even commodities for that matter. You have to buy cheap and sell expensive. That's about it. That is investing in simple words. But that is not easy because of a lot of greed and fear and the emotions associated with it. A lot of people feel fear of missing out. A lot of people feel, you know, that, okay, well, this is gone and I don't want to be there. So, well, that's the point. So it is not, very often I say this to people, it is absolutely not a popularity contest. So don't think, you know, everybody is going in that way and that is how everybody makes money. It doesn't happen that way. In fact, if you look at history, it simply doesn't work that way. So do the right study and, you know, decide to have some stock. That's perfectly fine. Go make sure that you don't bet your house on it. It's okay, but do it in a limited way. And if you think that you've got a better hand, then maybe you could scale it up a bit, but let the cycle pass by. In the meanwhile, seek professional advice is far better. And if you've done a thorough study, I think you'll have a very fruitful and enriching experience around it.
You know, there are a few other CIOs who have had this conversation with Mrinal, and they've pretty much elucidated something very similar. And I always respond to them with the same thing that Rahul Dravid used to say: the hardest thing to do is just defend the ball all day. Any other form of cricket is actually quite easy. So the basics are sometimes the hardest things to do. Just talking about your value discovery fund, Mrinal. When you took over this fund, it was about 1,500 crores. Today, it's about 15,000 crores. It's grown 10x. It's a phenomenal performance for the mandate that the fund has. Just the inherent nature of the fund, value discovery. You must have been frustrated at many points while your AUM kept going up for periods of underperformance where you've tried to find value and the market has tested you. So for a two-part question, how has this journey of taking this one fund 10x been, and sort of how have you dealt with periods of underperformance when you've tried to look for deep value and it has challenged your thesis?
So excellent question, Rahul. But the kind of feeling as so I am a natural value-oriented thinker and obviously value investor. And that's something that I didn't acquire. It is just the way I evolved. And clearly, my dharma is margin of safety, and I don't do lip service to it. I genuinely seek it. Well, what does happen is when you decide to have a high margin of safety approach to investing, then you are actually going to ensure that you don't put any more constraint because this is big enough constraint. And very often you would have seen equity investing requires patience. Now, patience is not about. Very often people think that when I say or when people say it demands patience, patience is about buying a stock and sitting. That's only 50% of the definition of patience in investing. Actually, there is a large bit of patience required, as you quoted Dravid, to not buy. That's also very important, to say no. As long as you have developed the temperament to say no, I think you will do fine as an investor. Now, that's a very important test, which I put across to a lot of managements also. It is very tempting to walk into something which is doing well in the day, but then need not work out for you in the long run, which is what I meant when I said, a short-term pull or a short-term flick that a lot of people would get tempted into. So the point I'm trying to put across is when you have a small fund, it wasn't actually 1500 odd crores, even in those days wasn't small. The industry also has grown in the meanwhile, but it was at least a reasonably mid-sized fund those days. So your investing style and strategy also has to evolve as the scale changes. So there were a set of things which were possible you could do when you had an XAUM, and then that style and strategy has to modify when you are 2-3x, and then subsequently 2-3x. And there are phases, and all value investors typically go through such phases where they are practically, struggling to find anything. And then, the allegation that very often indirectly or directly comes across and says, value, you're of no value because you're not finding value. But then the point is, again, the temperament has to come in. You have to continuously keep doing the right things. It is a test match. It is not at all, I would say, T20. So you have to keep, like a python, wait for the right price. And you are busy. You are very busy trying to evaluate businesses, trying to see what has changed and what is the kind of price that would make sense. It is a very often wrongly associated with value managers that they are very content with what they're doing. No, actually, value managers are very, very greedy about returns, and that is the reason that they are waiting. Let me just put it across. So businesses don't change every day. In fact, when a business does decide to change strategy, it takes 4-5 years if they succeed. Strategies, are not so easy to implement. It takes sometimes 2 years, sometimes 1 year, and it definitely does not change in months, any strategy. But the prices change every day. So is it really right that a price could be 20% ahead of what it was, let's say, 2 months ago? The business has changed so much, not necessarily all the time. So, well, the point I'm trying to mention is, it is the decision on the price that matters far more. And this is a true blue value investor talking to you. So I like the business. I don't like the price. So the price is what determines. So the price at which I buy determines the returns that I deliver to my unit holders. Now, so that has become the aim number one for me, and that is where the margin of safety comes in. And then a host of parameters, be it cash flow, be it management assessment, be it balance sheet strength, be it the goods and services or the industry or the sector that you are in, and a host of other things that get evaluated. But those evaluations actually don't change on a monthly basis. We keep updating, but things don't change. So we wait patiently for the price. Sometimes happens, that the market just goes off the mark, and you really struggle to get anything. And then there are phases like it has happened even in March this year, where we had abundance of things to buy, and we have had even deeper discounts in the market, like say in 2013 or even earlier to that year, and briefly in 2016 also, starting where we had at least the commodities and the financials coming down meaningfully. So there are those phases that come, you remain well prepared for it, and then you make up for those underperformances in the prior phases in such phases, and you would typically see that and value discovery is no exception. That typically when the markets pull back and when the markets recover again, that V kind of zone, value is kind of unbeatable strategy in that zone, because they are very well prepared for that kind of pullback, because they generally do not participate in the momentumish market, so they are better prepared. And then they participate very aggressively into weak markets, and which is what does well when the markets do recover. So we've seen that similarly in 2020 calendar year. In the last 6 months, we've seen that every time in the past that has happened. And then it is a very predictable phase. Typically, when value investing would typically have challenges, and that I would say, if somebody has to put across, is when the markets broadly are in excess of 20, 22 PE or 25 PE, which is when we start seeing, that value style, typical classical value style will start underperforming. But that's the nature of the beast. But then does it make up? The historical data, not only with us in our fund, but globally, is very supportive that it is amongst the most remunerative ways to go about investing for investors. But it is very demanding in terms of the fund manager as well as the unit holders, because it requires patience, and patience is easier said than done, is what I've seen in real life.
So basically what you're saying is, even though there may be a period of underperformance when you're doing this kind of a strategy, the period where it outperforms more than makes up for the period of underperformance, if that's a reasonable summation of what you just said.
Yes, I would say so.
So let me take you back to FMCG and try and tie it into the answer that you just gave me, and let's view it as a case study. So you have a tobacco company which is currently trading at about 15, 16 times 1 year forward. And you have the largest FMCG company in India, which is currently trading at about 50 times. One is obviously presenting deep value, trading at almost 1/3, 1/4 the valuations. And then, of course, it's not like the largest FMCG company in India has given you a 15% top line compounded. It's sort of been more on margin and profitability. How do you assess these two businesses when you are looking for value? And if you choose, say, the tobacco business, where incidentally the cheap has continued to get cheaper. It was cheap at 25p, it was cheap at 20, and sort of not fall into what they call a value trap, so to speak. And then on the other hand, you see the larger FMCG company continuing to reset valuations on the way up. How tough is it to take that decision, and how do you analyze these businesses if you were to take them as case studies?
So, well, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the conversation, the moot effort of us as research or value managers becomes the price. Because the businesses are well known to us, we've been tracking them for long. We also know what is the intent of the business, in what segment they want to push themselves. The judgment could very well be that will they succeed, or will they not succeed, or will they partially succeed. Well, having said that, you do come to a price, giving judgment and probability to things. Okay, there is a reasonable chance that in a period of time they will succeed, and these are the cash flows that subsequently could potentially accrue. And you might realize, okay, fine, this looks like that the business could potentially belong to, let's say, rupees 100. Okay, now and just for an example. So, and the stock could be trading, let's say, at 80, and you might say, okay, 100 looks like in 5 years and beyond. But then in the meanwhile, I might as well put money in risk-free return, and I am certain to get there. So, well, I think I should wait for a correction maybe, and then see if I can get a better price of entry. So it is not a judgment on the business. Frankly, the large FMCG companies are excellent businesses, and they are very well managed, and by all parameters, they've been done great to all stakeholders of theirs, including employees, vendors, ecosystem, and shareholders, and everything. And in fact, a lot of them are debt free, so which is all the more desirable for all equity shareholders, and they have great return ratios above that to offer. But then it might not, it might make a lot of sense, let's say, for an investor from a geography where their interest rates are practically zero, to walk into an entity which might be trading at 50 or 70 PE, which gives maybe 1.5 to 2% dividend yield. Because for him, it is like, okay, I see certainty of this dividend yield going ahead, and I have no doubt about it. There is potential of capital appreciation also, and there is possibility of growth anyway globally. And I'm very comfortable with the management, and I can get monies for 0.5%, let's say, in at least the developed part of the world. And if I get 2% dividend yield, there is a delta sitting for me. Plus, I have a great business to own and all those things. So we've seen a lot of these distortions that have happened in the marketplace as a function of very, very loose and accommodative monetary policy of global central banks. So I can completely understand the profile of investors who are invested into these 50 and 70p excellent businesses, but then not so excellent valuations, which is the way I would put it. But we don't come from that geographies. Our unit holders, our investors have a choice which still has a reasonable risk-free return. And then clearly 50, 70 Ps are way too steep to say that nothing can hit them. In fact, volume growths for a lot of those companies are very, very tricky. And, it's not fair to say that, the kind of volumes that we've had in such times, this is Corona infested times, are going to pursue. But then nevertheless, even besides that, there have been very low volume growth. So I would say the risk reward is not favorable. The margin of safety isn't good, and given the regime of risk return that we come from, at least for our investors, I think this doesn't make sense. So we let it go, although with remorse, because you would love to own great businesses at a cheap price. And then the next thing you do is, okay, look for businesses which are maybe trading okay, reasonably. Let's say amongst the companies you mentioned, a tobacco company, and it might have been 20 or P, let's say 6, 9 months ago. But then what has happened is there are changes that had happened. They have given a commitment on the exchange that they will increase their payout of dividend from their profits, which in the March month actually brought the stock due to that Corona something that the market had to a dividend yield which was as much as a risk-free return rate, and then that makes it a very attractive proposition. And also, as of now, maybe that business has a large portion of profit coming out from, let's say, cigarettes. But then a large portion of revenue is still coming out from FMCG, and it's growing. And FMCG going ahead can potentially become a dominant profit provider also, and there are businesses besides FMCG. So is the business on track to, at some point, maybe far away, be a non-tobacco business? Is there a chance? The answer is yes, it is potentially possible. But the business as of now benefits significantly from the synergies of procurement, because it's a rural facing procurement. So they benefit out of tobacco procurement, they benefit out of wheat procurement and other agri commodities. And the benefit is accrued to the business. So it makes sense for the business to be around. And as I mentioned, initially, one of the ways you can step in and create a significant alpha is by bringing abnormally high amount of patients compared to the street. And this is I guess one of those examples where there is no stopping of their FMCG business. And it is, if you just see the size of their FMCG business, it is amongst the largest in India already, and they continue to invest in that. If they wanted, they could potentially have created profitability out of it, but they don't need to. They continuously invest, they continue to innovate. It is something I like. I like to see FMCG companies innovating. I see a lot of FMCG companies have actually become so margin focused, they have stopped investing into the business. They are not capex driven businesses anyway. So they have to invest into the categories, innovate in terms of try out new things, meet the unmet needs. This is what a marketer does well, can we come up with fresh unmet needs, find the segment, address the segment, the STPs, typically the marketers call. And well, I see that very, very aggressively being pursued by that company, and that's a good thing. And then we also have, interestingly, a hotel business over there, which is not very good in terms of return ratios, but then a cyclical business, and that's of interest at this zone. We are in a zone where hotels are struggling, anything related to leisure and travel is struggling. But then, do you think, or do we think that hotels or entertainment, leisure or travel will cease to exist? The answer is no. The form can change. The travel will happen. In fact, I would say in the last 100 years, the most rapid advancements that human mankind has seen are in three fields. It is medical sciences, transportation, and communication. And well, this is what has made the society of humans that we are. This is the most rapid advances in the last 100 odd years that we've seen. And these are the areas that will continue to drive. Communication is something that is making us talk and do what we are doing, and this will continue to evolve. And we obviously don't believe this is the end of it. This is the start of it. And transportation is has what has made. So let's say 200 years ago, people used to go far away to maybe just conquer rather than see around the place. But then today, leisure is a large part of transportation. How we commute, a lot of industries are enabled based on the way and speed at which people are able to transport. Do I think that people will be going to New York from Mumbai by ship? Answer is no. They will be going by flight. So the planes and things will be there. So the point I'm trying to say is, there are deep cyclicals, there are well-managed businesses, and this tobacco business particularly does not find favor with a lot of ESG sensitive investing globally. A lot of pension funds, at least globally, are very sensitive to ESG, and rightly so, I would say. But then it does offer us an interesting entry point. In a limited way, we would be invested. We would not, as I said, better house on single things or single sectors. But then in a limited way, we would obviously be invested. And it does offer us a very high margin of safety in terms of dividend yield, which are more or less equivalent of the risk-free, or at least the 10-year GSEC that we see around. I hope a long answer, but then I hope I've addressed the question you're asking.
No, you have. You certainly have. In fact, while you were talking about it and you were talking about the metamorphosis of that company, I was just trying to compare it to somebody who's taken work from home to a totally different level by raising about 2 lakh crores in the last 1 month, and how that person has metamorphosized his company from an oil and gas to a retail and a consumer technology company. So I was just trying to think whether this company could do something similar in the long term in terms of metamorphosizing itself. But uh, coming back to the value fund, Mrinal, is that where the sort of genesis of you being a contrarian investor also germinated from?
So, well, the idea of being contrarian is not something that is a binding condition. In fact, typically a lot of people associate contrarian with value investors, but then it is because value investors are patient to wait for the right price. So, and the prices typically get interesting when they are sliding down. So, and that is how the association that, contrarian investor, the whole point is, if I get a stock which might have hit a upper circuit yesterday, but I think that, okay, it is going to be tripled in, let's say, in 5 years, then I'm perfectly game with it. So that's not a problem at all. If it fulfills all my parameters and I see a large scope of business evolution and profits growing, then that's perfectly okay. So the contrarian terms is something for an outsider to observe, but that's more to do with the way people practice. But then I wouldn't say that it's a binding condition. It is a condition that very often is associated, but that's not a limiting condition. In fact, a lot of times, as I mentioned, a superior business insight might make value investors step into a business which could have done well in the exchanges recently. That's perfectly okay. Very often, a better insight will actually give you a better hang of the scope of the business. For example, you might feel that, okay, as of now, the market size is believed to be, let's say, $5 billion for a business. But then you might realize, no, the 5 billion market is underestimating. This is 50 billion. And for that size, people aren't geared up. The stock is not even touching that or scratching that. So this is a long way to go, and then we need to step in. So those kind of things can also happen. So contrarian is very often associated, but then because growth investors typically mount upon growing stocks, so it is something that they don't. In fact, on the falling markets, they are in a hurry to sell, is what I've typically seen. So, and the value investors are where those stocks are getting exchanged hands So it's generally associated as contrarian, but that's, I would say, not a very binding condition. It is about the mismatch between price and value, the gap that matters, and it has to be substantial. How it works.
Fair enough. Mrinal, I just have a couple of questions coming in from some of the participants who logged in, and sort of I'll try and take two in one. One is, how do you value a company which is a next-gen company, and you are trying to discount what this company would be, say, 5-6 years on? I think he's probably benchmarking it to one of the conglomerates that we were discussing earlier that's in the process of metamorphosizing itself. And he specifically mentioned issues like retail, consumer technology, etc. So how do you value such companies where you don't have an e-commerce also, where you don't have too much listed evidence on how to approach these companies? And one other question is, since gold is the flavor of the season, do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, so interesting question. The question number one, how do you value something which is emerging? Let's say it has no precedence. It is not important that it has to have a stock market history. We don't have to do analysis or evaluation based on that. We can very well value a business which might not have any profits to report as of now, but could have substantial profits when things do stabilize later or they are done with the growth phase. So, to just elaborate a little on that, it is important that a lot of visibility in terms of cash flows does emerge. So we see that a lot of whenever there is a opportunity created, let's me just use an example from the same question, the gold rush in California. A host of people would go there, start digging, but then the reality is, that most people who actually dug the soil over there didn't find gold or didn't make anything out of it. In fact, the companies which provided the shovels, the Black & Decker is the name that emerged, and Levi's, which provided them the apparel to go ahead and do the digging, actually made it far bigger. So the two big businesses which came out of the gold rush in California was Black & Decker and let's say Levi's. But the point I'm trying to say is, it is not that you are in conflict with what the business wants to achieve. The business is very well on track to maybe go there. But then as an investor, you're trying to find something which is going to give you a good return. And in the value chain, there might be something else which might of be great interest to you, and which is where you will step in, or maybe a segment of that would be of interest to you. So, well, that's how we would approach. We might as well look at the base business itself, and if it is reasonably priced, it might be worthwhile to invest some monies in it. But then very often I've seen when there is too much of hype around things, businesses or at least stocks tend to get a bit on the stretch side. I wouldn't call them overvalued side, but on the stretch side. And by that I would say they don't leave much on the table. And it has to make definite sense to me, at least in a sensible way, that it leaves a lot on the table for us to make, because I have choices as an investor. I have choices to make, and I would not like to make an investment thesis out of too many assumptions. That's not the way I would approach investing. I would like to have investment thesis which have very low assumptions, and it still makes sense with conservative estimates to make an investment. And then we would think about what kind of risk that it onboards, and can we deal with those risks in the portfolio. Or we might just choose an alternate. If there is a retail business, we have choice between retail businesses. If there is a telecom business, we have choice between telecom businesses. And if you have an oil and gas business, we also have a choice. At the end of it, the portfolio has to deliver. So we might choose X and we might miss Y. But as long as X compensates for Y in the portfolio, it is fine. So it is no longer about every flower that you pick. 4 good flowers need not make a beautiful bouquet. It is a bouquet which can have actually very different set of flowers which individually might not look good. So the portfolio, the science of portfolio or the art of portfolio is a way too different from trying to do stock picking individually. So it's a deliberate thing sometimes when we let go of businesses which might be the flavor of the season, and maybe choosing to invest into some things where we are more certain, where there are lesser limelights and lesser eyeballs tracking, and we might find good value over there. Now that's typical of a value investors. You would obviously find us into not so favorable, not so in the season kind of stocks, So we were in healthcare, let's say 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, which has done well for us this year. And we were in telecom actually 3 years ago when the prices were cheap and the industry consolidated and we benefited and things like those, So we try to be ahead of the street. We'd like to have the risk reward in our favor. We like to make the right kind of choices in terms of management and businesses. And we like to be patient and wait and evaluate if things are working fine. If things are not working fine, maybe fine tune what we need to do with the portfolio and keep chugging along. At least in my investing practice, I've seen, it doesn't make a difference if you miss one or two. As long as you keep doing what is the right thing to do, the portfolio will be fine. It is not a problem. In fact, if you get too focused, if the portfolio is too dependent on a couple of stocks, that might create too much of a nasty experience at times, is what I've seen.
And your thoughts on gold, Mrinal? If any?
So gold is an interesting one. I would say at least some portion of personal wealth people should put in gold at this juncture, and it would merit some bit of investment as a hedge. And particularly because gold is an inflation asset. And in physical assets, if you look at the choice in physical assets, between real estate, gold, and the others, it is amongst the most liquid physical assets that exist around. And there are multiple options available. You have ETFs, you have sovereign gold bonds, you can physically own gold by paying GST. So there are good options. I would say gold does merit some bit of allocation, but not a large one. Some bit of it. Most households in India anyway have gold, but then some bit of allocation towards gold would not be a bad idea because it's quite liquid and it can be a good source of money when you need it.
How do you value intangibles, Mrinal, is a question that's coming in. Things like IPR, brand value, when you're assessing a company that are not physical assets, how do you sort of ascribe value to those sort of intangibles?
So I would add there are goodwills, there are and a host of intangibles actually. Eventually, you have to, it actually goes case by case, frankly. At one point, I did embark upon an exercise of trying to put a brand, put a value to a brand list, because a lot of companies have brands. And you might actually want to put a value to a brand and say, fine, this is a very well-established brand and it's not easy to dislodge or dislocate it and it can earn out of its own momentum. But then subsequently, when I did keep thinking about it, in fact, I engaged with an agency which was professional in trying to value a brand, and that is for M&A. So I thought I'll get some insights into it. But then if you ask me from a perspective of investor, if you have a brand, if a company has a brand, so well, it should in some form reflect on the P&L. So if you have a leading brand, it will reflect on the price or the realization or the margin. So if you ask me, a brand is not a brand if it is not reflecting on a P&L. Then it is a label. A lot of times people confuse with a label and a brand. I think a brand has to reflect. So for you to call it a brand, you have to show it to me that why is it a brand. So are you able to command better prices than the competition? Are you able to see through difficult times and pass on the price? I would say, are you able to do that? Because this is the trait of a brand. A brand it's a proper technical name. There are traits that a brand possesses. So it should be visible. So if it is able to show it in the P&L in terms of margins, in terms of realization, in terms of resilience in a downturn, or in terms of superior extensions when you launch new products within the same brand umbrella, it is part of the cash flows. So a brand actually, in my view, need not be separately valued. In fact, if it is really a brand, it will show up. It will show up on the P&L, it will show up on the cash flow. So there is nothing intangible about a brand. It is part of the P&L. So let's just put that aside. Then there are things like, other things or intangible. Now, very often, at least in my scheme of things, a business acquires another brand or business maybe and creates a goodwill or another kind of intangible out of it. Well, I don't think, I would value that too much. In fact, the way I would create margin of safety is, I will say, okay, you acquired it, fine. It is just preponing of the cost that you would have incurred to you. For anybody to acquire a business or acquire a brand, the basic rationale is that, okay, if I have to do this, it will take too much of time and too much of money. So I might as well, just pay. And, then from the next day on, I am in the business and I could potentially grow it from there. So that is the only economics that can justify an acquisition. Otherwise, if you think you can do it faster, you can do it cheaper, then why acquire it? Why pay for that? So, well, in some form, if you've acquired something, let's say, then you will have a strategy, and that kind of intangible at a later stage will show up in your in cash flows again. So, if you've done the right kind of acquisition for the right price, and then it will obviously show up in the future cash flows, maybe 3 years down the lane, maybe 5 years down the lane, and that is where I would be a little more liberal. If I have to give, benefit of doubt, I would say, okay, they've done the right thing. It is a very good bolt-on acquisition in terms of a brand or a business. It will do good to their business, and I think they will benefit significantly. So let's say 3 years down the lane, this is the synergy benefit, or this is the benefit that I see accruing, and so I'll make it part of the cash flows, and then it will be part of my valuation exercise itself. This is how I look at it. See, any intangible which is simply not impacting cash flows, I mean, what good is it? I mean, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to play with the money? No, not at all. So in some form or the other, every intangible has to show up in the cash flows, in the profitability, in the balance sheet, in some form. So as long as it shows up as a gain, as a business parameter, as a margin parameter, as a revenue parameter, then we would be willing to build it in our DCF, in our earnings estimate, in our cash flow estimates. So I would initially I began with the same question that was way early in my investing practice, but then I realized that we don't need to. In fact, particularly for a brand, it has to show up in the P&L, and it has to show up now, not even later. If you claim it's a brand, otherwise you have to claim you're investing in that brand, which is fine. Then we would say, okay, it subsequently would matter, and then we'll use a judgment around it. But if you say it's a brand already, then okay, for it to be a brand, is it the leading price maker, or is it amongst the top 3 leading price makers in the category? Is it able to command a higher volume? Is it creating a push or a pull? Are you able to justify the kind of advertising spend you are doing versus the sales? So what is the volume ratio with the advertising spend that you are doing? And if it is versus an investing brand, a brand that you're trying to create, your effort and investments are far higher. So we are able to evaluate that. We have a fair sense of those ratios. So we are able to fix that and find that, and we can see that impact. We don't have to ask companies about it. Actually, we can do that straight away in our evaluation itself. I hope that answers a very reasonably question.
It does. I think that's fairly comprehensive. So, Mrinal, just a couple of questions beyond business and work and your investing style. So, I read somewhere that Monday to Friday you're working, but your family decides what you need to do on the weekend. So, tell me how work from home has been, and what have you been up to while you've been home these last 3-4 months?
So it's an interesting experience, Rahul. I'm sure I'm not the only one. So it happened abruptly. So initial phase, we were trying to grapple with getting the IT infrastructure in place so that we have seamless ability to work. But then now my kids, see me on the machine, computer or the iPad or the phone, and they say, okay, is that what you do in terms of work? So, well, I can do that much work too. What is the great thing that you do? I can also talk to friends. Well, the point is, it is not about work from home. We are physically constrained to move out, and we do that only in a very required scenario or a very essential scenario. So, well, it has effects on your thought process in terms of how do you envisage the future. It makes me think that even if Corona is behind us, will we have a full-fledged office like we used to 6 months ago, or is it going to be a partial work from home? And will people trade off, or will employees trade off work from home versus other things in life? Because it saves you travel time, and maybe you could use that more productively for your health, for your work, for your family. And I guess that's a good trade-off. People will seriously think about it. I also think that, given the way we are able to communicate, will business travel emerge the way it used to be earlier? Will we see a large amount of business travel that we were seeing, or it is going to be largely leisure travel going ahead? We will see business travel, no doubt about it. Will we see deal signings, international deal signings happening digitally now? instead of people physically coming and we having in-person signings of deals. I don't know if that's going to. So a lot of changes are going to certainly happen, and I'm talking with the expectation that Corona would be behind us at some point. And at home, obviously I do long for that fresh air, going out, without a mask, maybe in the normal times, maybe play around with kids and, meet friends and, go out for dinner and all that. So all those things, seem like, which were so simple earlier, seem like, a big desire, a big thing that you would wish for. Let's see how it progresses. A host of things, now it can be a ranting conversation rather than anything else.
No, I hear you. I think if all of us are probably waiting for normalcy at some point, hopefully in a not too distant future. But then you like to follow sports, but you don't get time for it.
Yeah. It is very busy actually. Work from home is not at all. In fact, I would say work from office was more disciplined. Once you come back from office, you would be at home, and you would be home both mentally and physically, at least largely. I would not fully, but largely at least. But then, as of now, it seems like there's no end to it. I mean, it's morning, night, 7 days of the week.
Well, I hope you've gotten a chance to catch some of the revival of Test cricket because it happens late in the evening. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see the England-West Indies series, but Mrinal, I must tell you, we've had the highest ever participation for this series that we've ever done. We've had over 600 people log into this broadcast, which is something which I began when we started this series. I didn't think, where it would land up, but this is probably the largest we've ever got. So credits to you and your fan following for that. And it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you, Mrinal. I think obviously not talking to you as your sell-side broker today, but just trying to understand you as a fund manager and a person. It's been delightful to listen to your thought process sitting across you virtually after so long. And I hope you enjoyed being on. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating listening to your thoughts.
It's amazing. I mean, I'm very glad, Rahul, that we could make this work. And that's thanks to you and Nirmal Bang for this. Thank you very much.
Great, Mrinal. Stay safe. Hopefully, I'll see you in person in the not too distant future. And once again, thank you so much for this opportunity and having this conversation with me. And also to all the people who've logged in to watch this broadcast. A big thank you to all of you. Stay safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.